Welcome. You are listening to the Mindful Minute, meditations created for everyday joy. I'm your host, Meryl Arnett, and my passion is making meditation accessible and enjoyable. This podcast is recorded from my live Monday night meditation class, where we have a brief discussion followed by a guided meditation. If you would like to access these meditation practices as standalone audio files for your daily practice, please subscribe to my newsletter at merylarnett.com. It's free, and you'll receive a new mini meditation each week, along with behind-the-scenes content and bonus material for each podcast episode. All right, let's grab a cup of tea, a comfy seat, and settle in for today's practice. Welcome, my friends, to another episode of the Mindful Minute. So if you have been following along the last few weeks, we have just completed a really robust meditation series called The Ethics of Meditation. And as we wrap this series up, where we've really been exploring these 5 tenets of ethical teachings that are embedded within a meditation practice, I thought it would be really powerful to bring a conversation to you with author Nina Simons. Nina Simons is the co-founder and chief relationship officer at Bioneers. Throughout her career spanning the nonprofit, social entrepreneurship, corporate and philanthropic sectors, Nina has worked with thousands of diverse women across discipline, race, class, age, and orientation to create conditions of mutual learning, trust, and leadership development. Nina authored a book, Nature, Culture, and the Sacred: A Woman Listens for Leadership, which I found to be a profound read. She just recently released the 2nd edition of this book, which includes discussion guides and embodied practices, because this book, after winning a Gold Nautilus award in the categories of women, intersectionality, and social justice, was being used in classrooms, in circles, in organizations as ways to foster mindfulness, leadership, and engaged growth. In this conversation, Nina and I talk about so many things. It was such a fun conversation. Specifically, we focused on talking about what it means to bring the archetypal feminine into our leadership, not just masculine versus feminine in terms of gender orientation, but this deeper archetypal meaning. What does that look like? What does it mean? We talk about the intertwining of our sacred practices and our social activism. We talk about generational trauma and the overlapping crises of our time, Indigenous issues, racial equality, gender balance, and the environment. We talk about a documentary that changed Nina's life in the course of her work called The Burning Times. You'll find a link to that documentary in the show notes. So without further ado, let's jump into this conversation. I think you'll find it uplifting, hopeful, and I hope really, really inspiring to do a little bit of research, maybe pick up Nina's book, and let's see where we grow together. All right, Nina Simons, welcome to the Mindful Minute. Thank you for taking some time today.
I'm delighted to be with you, Meryl. Thank you for having me.
So we are here today to talk about the 2nd edition of your book, Nature, Culture, and the Sacred: A Woman Listens for Leadership. And I'll tell you, I get a lot of emails that are like, oh, I wrote a book or I've published a book. Would you like to do an interview? And sometimes they fit, sometimes they don't. And all I saw was Nature, Culture, the Sacred. And I was like, yes, yes, send me that book. Let's talk. So I'm so happy that we're getting to connect today.
Me too. Well, that's a great story.
And I thought maybe we would start a bit with where you start in the book, was a little bit of who you are and how you not only found yourself as a leader, but really embraced that role of leadership.
Sure. Well, I don't know where to start.
It's a
It
big
seems I've
question.
told this story before, but just a sec. Um, you know, early in my life, my first love was theater because I knew we had to change people's consciousness. And I fell in love with how theater could give people an embodied experience that would cause them to question their belief systems and their values.
Mm.
Um, but that's not what most of theater is. That's what a little bit of theater is. So I fell in love with that and then realized how hard it was going to be to make a living at that, and went on to manage restaurants and work in the arts. And then I encountered my wonderful partner and got involved with the film he was finishing, which was about alternative cancer therapies. And I realized that, one of the core impulses in me is to be a healer, and to be a healer not in a one on one, hands on way, but I think my favorite job description I've ever been given was culture doctor.
Ooh, I
And a
love
strong
that.
looked at my chart. I know. And she said, "Oh, you're a culture doctor." And I was like, "Yes." So we finished the film, and then I went with him to an amazing biodiversity garden in southern New Mexico. And as we walked through that garden, the master gardener who was cultivating it introduced us to each plant. And he would introduce us by the Latin name and the common name, and then explain how it was related to everything else around it. And it was a garden of relationship. And what I realized was that I had never seen a garden so beautiful. My senses were just dancing between the flowers and the fruits and the smells and the pollinators and the colors. It was just glorious. And then he explained why he was growing this garden, which was to protect the biodiversity of life itself, because all of these little mom and pop seed companies were getting gobbled up by multinational corporations, and it was threatening. We were losing biodiversity at an alarming rate. And this was way back in the late 80s. And what wound up happening was that he and my husband and partner wound up starting a company called Seeds of Change. And I went to work. When I walked out of that garden, I felt like the spirit of the natural world tapped me on the shoulder and said, "You're working for me now." And I had no idea how to respond to that call. I didn't think I had any skills for it. I had no idea. But the call was undeniable. And so I went to work for this startup social entrepreneurial company, and I learned a ton and I loved it. And it felt like some of the most sacred work I've ever done. And my husband is a journalist as well as a filmmaker, and he was researching and finding all these amazing people who had solutions to many of our most pressing social and environmental challenges. And he was finding out about them, but to his chagrin, he realized no one had ever heard of them. And when he was bemoaning that fact to a friend in a hot tub, the friend said, "Why don't you have a conference?" And Kenny said, "Well, I've never been to a conference. It sounds boring. Why would I do that?" and and the friend said, "Here's a grant. Go have a conference." And Kenny came to me because of my theater background and said, "Will you help me invent a conference?" And so we did. And that was the beginning of our organization, which is called Bioneers. And together we have shepherded and co-evolved Bioneers over the years. And since then, part of what happened for me was really 3 or 4 quick awakenings. I had an awakening about how my gender was influencing my life. And I had thought after college that I was stepping out into the world with a level playing field. And it took me some time to recognize how not true that was, And so I saw a film, which all listeners can access online, called The Burning Times. And it tells the amazing story of 300 years of European history that had correlatives all over the world, where somewhere between 50,000 and millions of women were systematically persecuted and tortured and burned for the supposed crime of being witches. And when I saw that, I was flabbergasted. I knew that that story was still alive in me. It was the first time that a whole bunch of fears that I had made sense to me. And I wondered, why wasn't I taught this in school? This is a huge event in human history. And then I wondered how much of it is true. And I went to work researching, and what I found was that many of our human systems of civilization were flipped from the purview of the feminine and women to the purview and the power of men during that time. Our medical system, our land system, our economic system, a lot of things. And so that sent me on a journey. And then I got recognized for my leadership with Bioneers, and I didn't like it at all. I thought, this is not a title that I feel like I've earned, number one. Number two, I felt like it painted a target on my back, which I really didn't like. And number three, I just had this icky feeling in my body, like something about this name feels false to who I am. And it's not who I aspire to be. And then I started investigating, and I started convening groups of women who were leaders. And lo and behold, all these women who had been selected for their leadership came into this retreat and said, no, I don't consider myself a leader. I wouldn't call myself a leader. And so I began unpacking it and realized we're all reinventing leadership now. And as I worked with those women who were very diverse by design, they were diverse in every way, not just racially or ethnically, but in age, in discipline, in all kinds of ways, right? And I realized I began to feel called to learn a lot more about racial equity and justice. And so let's see. I mean, I'm a woman who has a deep call toward the leadership of women and rebalancing the feminine and masculine in us all, and in our culture and in our institutions, as well as, racial equity, which gender equity and racial equity sit side by side, I think. So it's a long answer. Sorry.
No, it's a great answer. And okay, so we have to have a couple different podcasts because I want to talk about theater. I'm so into theater as like spiritual response.
Yes.
So like we have to have a conversation about that one day. There was something else you said that I was like, well, that's you said like a garden or a relational,
a garden of relationships.
A garden of, I'm like, well, let's have a conversation about that.
Ooh,
but
yes.
We'll stay focused on the book for today. So it's interesting to me because one of the threads that I found so fascinating was how you pull together what I think we could look at or feel when we are looking from the outside, perhaps, that these are such disparate issues, but you bring together, indigenous issues, environmental issues, racial equity, gender balance, it's so many issues that I think it would be really easy to say, that's too much. I'm overwhelmed or scared, and I can't pay attention to that many things. And yet in this book, it is woven together to be a thing, right? Like these are elements or maybe symptoms, if you even want to call it that, of an issue. Does that land for you?
Oh, it totally does. And I think that how I came to be that way, Meryl, is because of Bioneers. Really, I have had the benefit of over 30 years of graduate school with Bioneers. And really what Bioneers says is that nature is the mother of all issues, that we can't separate what's human from what's nature because we are nature, right? Nature made us. And actually nature is our elder. And so for me, all of those issues are interwoven. And what I'm delighting in now that I'm 66 years old is that for the first time in my life, having all those disparate interests feels like an asset and a virtue instead of a hindrance. I've been apologizing for it way too long, you
Mm.
know? And I'm so glad the book really gave me an opportunity to not only weave together the issues, but also to really offer people a path to explore what has been most useful for me in my own learning, and to give people discussion guides and prompts and questions that really wove together everything I've learned in the last, 25 years.
And
So it
it,
feels good.
yeah. And if you were going to give, this feels like maybe too limiting, so you tell me, but if we were going to give this an overarching entryway to step into what you're writing about, would you say archetypal feminine, like balancing archetypal feminine energy? Is this what you might say? Should we start there?
Well, absolutely. I mean, that would be one part of it. And I
Hmm.
think integrating the invisible world or the
Mm.
sacred, right, is an essential aspect of it. Um, it's why I chose that title, because I found that there were, at this stage in my life, there's a lot of introspection and really wondering and questioning, like, have I given everything I'm here to give? What's more, what's most essential to me? And what I realized was really I serve nature, culture, and the sacred, and rebalancing the masculine and the feminine is the clearest single pathway I can see for healing the whole.
Mm. So let's talk a little bit about what you mean by archetypal feminine versus I identify as a woman in my physical body, right? There's a
Right,
big
right.
difference. Let's talk about what that is.
Sure. Thanks. Well, we all have masculine and feminine within us. The ancients, you know, who came up with the yin and yang symbol were pointing toward that. And in this day and age, we've inherited all kinds of twisted definitions of what quote, masculine and feminine mean. But in fact, on the deepest archetypal level, as you say, there is an active principle and a receptive principle. And we have elevated the active and devalued the receptive, which is why a woman listens for leadership.
Mm.
Because in my meditation practice, I've I've really reinforced and learned the value of deep listening, and of rest, and of, not of working to release myself from the patterns of overproductivity, right? Because I think we have inherited a culture that is so overly archetypally masculinized, and if you think about a lot of the movies that Hollywood produces, right? They tend to be geared for adolescent boys or men of all ages, or they're called chick flicks. And the chick flicks are the ones that are about relationship. Well, excuse me, I believe relationship is the very fabric of life. So, so let's not demean it by calling it a chick flick and imagine that it's not for everybody. So, I think men need to reclaim the parts of themselves that are receptive, that are sensitive, that are emotional, that are embodied, and we all need to rebalance. My aim as I explored what leadership is being reinvented as, what I realized was I want to have a full array of human capacities to draw from within myself, and I called that full spectrum leadership. Because if there's a continuum of masculine and feminine, I want to be able to pull from anywhere on that continuum, given what's needed and what the circumstances require of me. So I think, regardless of what gendered body you may be in right now, we all need to rebalance the masculine and the feminine. And I think that's what a lot of young people who are refusing the binary are really pointing towards. And they're so spot on.
I would love to hear a little bit about your meditation practice
Mm,
and the overlap you see. This is another element that I really felt was highlighted in the book was that the sacred, the introspective, the receptive, to use the word you just used, and activism are not disparate elements, right?
mm,
I saw those
yes.
very woven together in your writing. I feel
Mm,
that become more and more highlighted the further I go in my own meditative journey. And
mm,
I try to pull it out in our conversations quite a bit. I'd love to hear a little bit about your journey in meditation.
mm. Oh, that's such a great question. Well, I think that we're in a moment where sacred activism is exactly what's called for, right? And the fact that we have split them apart, that false separation has been hindering our effectiveness for a long time. Um, well, I got inspired to meditate really from a dear friend and colleague named Deborah Eden Tull,
A
who
former guest
teaches,
on the
she's written a beautiful,
podcast.
exactly. So check out her podcast. She's written several beautiful books, but she coined the phrase relational mindfulness. And when I heard her say, meditation is the subtlest form of self love, a huge light bulb went off over my head. And I thought, oh, I want that. I want to experience that. And so, I have had the gift of her teaching, which of course is beautiful. And what I find is that we humans are in a situation now that is actually existentially pretty dire. It's a time of so much loss and hardship. It's a time where we have systems running out of control, and you know the dying dinosaur of patriarchy is doing a lot of damage on its way out. And so I believe that activism that isn't informed by that quiet, still place within us and all of our guides and support in the invisible world and the natural world. We all have different versions of how we relate to the sacred. But what I find is in my sitting practice, I get insight from all around me. And sometimes it's through something my body understands. Sometimes it's um, from imagining and convening with my guides. Um, Sometimes it's from asking a question and sitting and listening for an answer, however long it may take. Um, and if our activism and our leadership, I mean, I think we're all called to be leaders. And I think we have as many forms of leadership as there are humans alive on the planet at this time. And I think that the old definition was very self-limiting, and parenting is one of the most powerful, beautiful forms of leadership I can imagine, as is teaching and healing and, so many things and arts. So I just think, there's a piece in the book that I love that's a conversation with Terry Tempest Williams.
Mm.
And one of the things she says to me in it is that she loves, whenever she encounters an apparent binary or contradiction, she finds ways for it to dance with each other. And I was like, oh, yeah, this binary thing, it's not only about the masculine and the feminine, it's also about the sacred and activism. How can they actually meet in a place that, right now we have a terrible syndrome of activists sort of shooting across the circle, getting in their own way so much, rebelling against authority to the extent that they're not functional.
Mm.
And our movements are actually self sabotaging. And for me, one of my favorite visions is that our movements find the ways to find common cause. And that's going to happen through listening to each other, deep listening,
Mm.
and being willing to slow down enough to build relationship. and part of that rebalancing of the yin and yang is slowing down enough to tend to the relationships. So
It's
that's a long way
interesting.
of responding. Yeah.
Yeah, that was such a good response, and you said so much in there that I don't want to lose any of the threads. The thing that's really jumping out at me is I often think about meditative practice as a practice of learning to get comfortable with paradox,
Ah,
because it feels like um, so much of what feels like clear black and white suddenly becomes very gray once we come
yeah.
inside and we actually start to listen. So I really heard that statement. And the other thing
Mm,
is, these words around deep listening, around relational, receptive, they're words that it can be really easy to use them when we're like, "Oh, I'm talking about this lovely thing called meditation. I do it by myself or maybe with one other person. It's in a beautiful space. There's incense and bells." But then I leave and I turn on the news or I sit in my car in bumper to bumper traffic and I'm not thinking about deep listening or relational engagement or receptivity. And the idea in our practice and in your book is, can we bring these elements into what we perceive as, you call it leadership. I would think about just like our work life, right?
hmm
Like I'm
hmm
no longer a mom, I'm working. So I have to
Right.
be different, right?
Right. Right. Well, and it's so interesting you say that because I realized early on that one of my aims in my life that felt like a sole purpose was I wanted to be as congruent as I knew how, that I wanted to be the same in every situation. I
Mm.
wanted to be reliably all me, right? And not have to move masks. Um, and and the other thing I love about what you were saying about paradox is um, I believe I'm having this sort of romance with hardship right now. It's kind of
Love
weird.
that phrase.
but but I think one of my mentors is Joanna Macy, and she
Mm.
said something beautiful in her blurb for the book, which was something to the effect that Nina not only understands the gifts that women bring to leadership, but the ways that obstacles and hardship strengthen us and make us more resilient.
Mm.
And and so I'm just noticing, I do a lot of work with women who have trauma, and I'm noticing that, in many ways, my life has brought me to believe that those of us who, whether in this life or past lives, have intergenerational trauma, have developed a kind of resilience that's really needed right now. And so, we tend to turn away from trauma, we tend to turn away from conflict, and they're important and useful tools.
They really are. And I'm very, very interested in our awareness and the ways that we pay attention to intergenerational trauma specifically. I've had, as you were talking about the burning times, I was thinking, oh, that's so interesting. I have absolutely had a moment in my life where I was like, that is generational trauma. And it's not a little bit buried in my body. It is vibrantly alive
Yeah,
and radiating outward in the way that I respond to situations in my life. That's fascinating. And the more this comes to awareness, it stops being this, I don't love this word, so I'm going to put it in quotes, this crazy response that I have to certain things.
right.
And it gives me this sense of like, oh, I totally know why I feel this way. Let me
Yeah,
pay attention to what's really happening in the moment, what's true, and
right.
what can I carry forward from, generations of information buried in my cells. I love
Yeah.
that you brought this up. So interesting to me.
The thing that comes up for me listening to you, Meryl, is that the intergenerational trauma from the burning times, I believe, is in every human being alive today.
Mm.
So it helps me have compassion for the men who also carry that. They carry that ancestral memory, right? In order to be safe, you had to be very masculine in that time. And, and you had to tough it out and you had to, right? So, and 7 generations of children witnessed this,
Mm.
right? So I believe it's a cultural legacy that we all carry. And that helps me understand why the biases run so deep.
Mm. One of the things, I want to say two things. So first, I'm going to say this because you were talking earlier about one of your sole purposes being to be congruent. And I want to say yesterday, I have a 4-year-old daughter. And yesterday I got the dreaded call from school. You need to come get your daughter. She's not well. And I brought her home. It's a whole long story we don't have to get into, but I had a moment yesterday where I was like, oh, I'm going to have to cancel this interview. And I hate having to do that. And I felt myself be like, oh my God, what can I do? Who can I call to help me so I don't have to cancel the interview? And then I thought, I feel like if anybody in the world would understand me saying, my daughter is sick, I can't do this interview, it would be Nina. And luckily she's fine. And I didn't have to
Oh,
cancel the interview. It
good.
all worked out.
Oh,
But
good.
I had a moment where I was like, right, you are. I felt
Yeah.
that through your book. I felt that
Thank you.
I would be able to do that and just say, like, also I'm a mom, right?
Oh, that's
Because we
beautiful.
are.
Of course.
Right.
Yes. Yeah.
So the other thing I wanted to say is, as we were talking about before we started recording, this interview is airing right at the end of a series that feels really important to me, which is about the ethical teachings that are sort of imbued in traditional meditation. And as I set the series up, I was explaining that these teachings, which in different words, but same concepts, show up in tantric meditation, in Buddhism, and all of the sort of ancient lineages,
Mm,
and traditionally are always taught first. Before
mm,
you do any seated practice, before
mm.
you do any movement,
Wow.
you are going to learn these ethical teachings. And yet, here in the West, I didn't learn the ethical teachings until I was in not my first, but my second level of teacher
Mm,
training.
mm,
And it's interesting because I felt very much like, well, the ethical teachings are implicit,
mm,
right? It's there. You'll find it on your own if you're meditating. And what I'm realizing is maybe, but we need to be naming them and bringing them to the forefront. And as I was reading your book, I was feeling that same energy of you're naming nature,
mm,
culture, the sacred. We could sort of sense the implicit value, but we need to be naming it and pulling it
mm,
forward into the
mm,
forefront. I wonder
mm.
how you see maybe any overlap there.
Oh, I love that. Oh, gosh. Well, um, what I find is that I think we all need to name what has the deepest value now. And what I keep finding from my work with Indigenous mentors is that I learn from them how to be a human being. And that's not something that anyone in our culture teaches us. And it sounds to me like that's what you're pointing to.
Mm.
I mean, my lineage is Jewish, and I don't have a religious practice or affiliation with it, but culturally, I feel deeply, deeply aligned with it. And the core premise of Tikkun Olam is that you leave the world a better place for having lived in it. And I love that. I mean, that feels like the most ethical principle. Of course, wouldn't we all want to do that? Um, but so I think you're absolutely right, and I want to take your course because
Oh,
I
well, you're welcome
haven't
to.
learned them.
That's so funny. I'm Jewish also. I love that little
Uh-huh,
connection. How beautiful.
uh-huh.
Um, yeah, and I think that's so interesting. I love the reminder that we're learning how to be human beings. And you're right. You're
Yeah.
absolutely right. I mean, I think the sort of cliche phrase is we're human doings. It's cliche for a reason. That feels resonant,
Yeah, of
right? To
course.
make the shift, to
Yeah.
being is what you're pointing to.
Well, and one of my earliest luminous moments with Bioneers was hearing a native elder from a pueblo near to Santa Fe whose people went through some of the most egregious violence in colonization. And we were having a panel about the 500-year anniversary of Columbus setting foot on these shores.
Mm.
And he said, and he was a governor of that pueblo, and he said, 500 years ago, you came and we welcomed you with open arms. If you came again today, we would do the same. And he was absolutely centered, clear, and
Mm.
full of integrity. And I thought, oh my gosh, I have so much to learn from these people. Wow. So yeah,
Mhm.
yeah, how to be human beings.
In the second edition of the book, you added discussion guides, some prompts for reflection, which I
Mhm.
love because I think it's giving us the opportunity to read. I like that um, the book is comprised a bit of your story. It brings in other stories, other voices as well. It brings in teachings, but with the reflection guides, it's giving us the opportunity to see how does that relate to what I'm thinking, what I'm feeling, how I'm moving through the world. You're inviting us to embody some of these teachings. Yes.
Yes,
Mm.
and to listen for our own inner guidance, because I can't know what's right for anyone else. But these are prompts that we developed over years of having women's retreats. And I thought, why not offer as many tools as I know how? And there are embodied practices as well, so that, people can do them either on their own or in circles with other women.
And you
Yeah.
said this a bit earlier in the conversation, but let's highlight it. You're not just talking about women who want to be CEOs of their own company. Who are you talking to?
Well, one of my favorite reviews came from a man who said, I love this book. It's helping me understand my daughters and my wife better.
Mm,
And so this book is for anyone. Really, it's a compilation of my deepest, I don't know, reflections over 25 years. And and it's certainly for any woman or girl who is reaching for understanding herself better, her own sense of purpose and what calls her, um, and for exploring, this beautiful multidimensional world that I've been privileged to be immersed in.
mm. Yeah, I feel it's not a meditation book. It is a book about, the ways that we walk through the world
Mm,
with our inner light on, right?
mhm,
I feel
mhm.
that so much. It's the moving version of meditation.
Well, hopefully it's also pointing towards that sacred activism you were speaking to,
That's right.
because really part of what I've found, Meryl, is, in doing the work with women, I've experienced being in what Martin Luther King called beloved community. And being in beloved community with women who are vastly different than I am is one of the most ah, delicious, amazing, heartful, soul nourishing experiences I can imagine. And I want it for everyone, you know?
Mhm.
Yeah.
Is there anything I didn't ask you that you wanted to highlight or talk about today?
Mm. Ah, yes, meditation as the subtlest form of self love.
Yes. Ugh. I was like, don't forget that sentence. Write it down. Let's
Thank
talk
you,
about
Eden.
that. Yes.
Yeah. I think that I always resisted meditation before I met Eden, because I thought it was all about being rigorous and accountable and rules and right and like sharp definition. And I have a tendency to rebel against a lot of that.
Mm.
And once I met Eden and understood that my meditation practice could be about accepting everything that happens and all of me, and just in the course of doing that, not making myself wrong for having other thoughts, just letting them drift by. And in the course of doing that, what I found is that there's a benefit that I can experience in my body. Meryl, I'm sure maybe you have something similar. It feels to me like there's a sacred still pool in my inner being that gets fed by my sitting practice every morning. And when I do that, no matter how kerfuffled I get out there in the world with, accidents and road rage and politics and, the crises all around us, that still pool is always there. And I can feel it. And it only takes a minute, a second for me to touch in with it. And that feels like it gives me so much ballast and this beautiful kind of, balance that, and a wellspring that I don't want to live without,
I love how you worded that. And it's so funny. Right before I jumped on with you, I was working with a private client of mine who has a lovely meditation practice. And he said to me, after telling me 20 minutes of how beautiful and interesting and expansive and amazing this last week of practice has been, he says, but how do I get there? Like, how do I get to this? He's like, I don't think I'm there. And we had this whole conversation around well, you just can't you can't will yourself there. You are there. And the minute you let yourself be there, you will be, right? We just have to right here in the middle of everything that's going on. We had this whole, you talk in a circle. We had a whole circle of you can't make it happen. You just have to be where you are. I love that you said it so beautifully. I wish you'd been in my call earlier.
Well, this is such a treat, Meryl. Thank you.
Nina, is my pleasure. Thank you so much. Tell listeners where they can find more about you, your work, the book. Where should we look?
Sure. Well, I am childless by choice, but my child really is a magnificent organization called Bioneers. So please go visit bioneers.org and sign up for the newsletter or listen to a podcast. You won't be sorry. And ninasimons.com has my books and anywhere that I'm teaching or speaking. And if you do read the book, please give me the gift of writing a review on Amazon, because whether you buy it there or not, because it really matters and I need them. So thank you. And thank you so much, Meryl. What a treat.
Thank you, Nina. Listeners, all of these links will be in the show notes. I will highlight again, reviews are the most important thing in the world to anybody out there creating something. So please take the time to do that. And Nina, I hope this is the first of many conversations. This was so lovely.
I hope so too. And do link to the Burning Times because everyone needs to see it.
Thank you. I will do that.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thanks for listening to the Mindful Minute. If you enjoyed today's episode, please consider sharing it with a friend or leaving me a review wherever you get your podcasts. This helps others to find the show, and let's face it, we could definitely use more meditators in this world. The Mindful Minute is recorded on Muskogee land and produced with the support of Madeline Day Production Management and Brianna Nielsen Virtual Assistants. To join my live classes, ask questions, or learn more about my teacher trainings, please visit merylarnett.com. Thanks again for listening. I'll see you guys next week.